Christmas was never about stealing a pagan holiday, but about confronting paganism itself. You've probably heard this before, that December 25th was never Christian, that Christmas was borrowed from the worship of the sun, that behind the lights, the trees, and the carols hides an ancient pagan god. And here's the uncomfortable part. That claim is not entirely false. There is historical truth behind it. Real dates, real symbols, real solar imagery. But what you've been told is only half the story. Because history doesn't just ask where a tradition came from, it asks what was done with it. This video is not here to attack faith, and it's not here to defend tradition blindly. It's here to uncover a forgotten theological strategy of the early church, a strategy so subtle, so dangerous, that it didn't destroy pagan symbols. It challenged them at their very core. And to understand it, we have to step back into a world where time itself was sacred, and where light was never just light.
In the ancient Roman world, the calendar was never neutral. A date was not simply a square on a page. It was a message, a ritual, a declaration about what reality meant. People did not merely pass through days, they inhabited them. And every day carried an invisible signature, a patron deity, a cosmic rhythm, an assumption about what governed the universe. That is why the Day of the Sun mattered. Long before modern people treated Sunday as a weekend marker, the Roman imagination treated it as a symbolic throne. The sun was not only a physical object in the sky, it was a metaphor of power, predictable, sovereign, life-giving, and relentless. It marked the seasons. It shaped agriculture. It governed time. And because it governed time, it became a natural candidate for worship. To worship the sun was to worship stability itself. Now, place that worldview beside the winter solstice, when the nights stretch long and the daylight seems to weaken. For a pre-modern society, this was not just a seasonal change. It felt like a spiritual crisis. Darkness appeared to be winning. And then, slowly, measurably, the light returned. You can imagine what that return meant to the ancient mind. It was victory staged in the heavens, a cosmic narrative written into the sky, decline, near death, and revival. The turning of the year became a turning of destiny. People celebrated not merely because the days would brighten, but because brightening days felt like the universe had chosen order over chaos once again. Here is the key. This world already had a language for salvation, and that language was light. That is why any later Christian claim about Jesus as the light would not enter an empty room. It would enter a crowded marketplace of symbols, where the sun had already been crowned with meaning. And now we arrive at the tension that makes this entire topic so explosive. If the Roman world already owned the story of light conquering darkness, what happens when Christianity arrives with a competing claim? The next detail is the one that unsettles almost everyone, both believers and skeptics, because it removes the comfort of easy certainty. The Bible never gives the date of Jesus' birth. It gives signs, circumstances, and theology. It gives angels and shepherds. It gives a star and wise men. It gives a mother's wonder and a tyrant's fear. But it does not give a day on the calendar. That silence is not an oversight. It tells us something about the priorities of the earliest Christian message. The first generations of believers did not organize their faith around a birthday. They organized it around a death and a resurrection. The earliest preaching was not, "He was born," it was, "He is risen." In fact, if you listen to the emotional gravity of the New Testament, you can feel where the weight lands, not on the manger, but on the cross, not on the date, but on the meaning. So why did Christians later begin to care about the date at all?
Because communities grow. They form rhythms. They build traditions. They mark time not only to remember, but to become a people. A living faith eventually finds a calendar because time is one of the most powerful tools for shaping identity. And once a community begins to mark time, questions naturally surface. When should we commemorate the Incarnation? When should we remember the arrival of Christ into history? Here is where the story becomes fascinating. Early Christians did not agree. Different regions held different ideas. Some emphasized one season, some another. There wasn't a single universal date from the beginning. There was a process, messy, human, theological, and deeply historical. That means one thing with absolute clarity. The date, whatever it became, was a decision made within culture, not handed down as a line of scripture. And now the most controversial question becomes unavoidable. If the Bible is silent and the culture is loud, did the church choose its date because the pagan world had already made it powerful?
This is the place where most viral explanations oversimplify, either to attack Christianity or to defend it with slogans. But the deeper truth lives in the middle, and it's far more unsettling. Christianity did not arrive as a religion without symbols. It arrived with some of the most radical symbols imaginable, especially the symbol of light. From its earliest preaching, Christianity spoke of illumination, truth breaking through darkness, revelation piercing confusion, life emerging where death seemed final. For Christians, darkness was not merely a lack of sunlight. Darkness was ignorance, sin, fear, corruption, and spiritual bondage. Light was not merely brightness. Light was the presence of God, the unveiling of truth, the arrival of salvation. So when Christians called Jesus the light of the world, they were not borrowing a pagan metaphor. They were stating a theological claim that ultimate reality had stepped into human history. Now, notice what this does to the pagan worldview. If the Roman cult of the sun said, light is divine, Christianity responded, light is created. If paganism said, the sun rules the cosmos, Christianity responded, the Creator rules the sun. If paganism saw the solstice as a heavenly victory, Christianity proclaimed a deeper victory, one not measured in minutes of daylight, but in the defeat of death itself. This is not imitation. It is confrontation. Here, the church's strategy, whether explicit or instinctive, becomes clearer. It does not always destroy a symbol. It recenters it. It takes the cultural language people already understand and moves the throne. In practical terms, that means this. The question is not whether December 25th already carried light symbolism. It did. The question is what Christianity did with that symbolism once it began to shape public time. Did the church baptize pagan worship? Or did it declare that pagan worship had misidentified the source of light? A useful way to grasp this is to imagine two storytellers using the same imagery but telling opposite stories. The pagan storyteller says, the sun returns, the cosmos renews itself, worship the power above. The Christian storyteller says, a greater light has arrived. The cosmos is not your savior. The Creator has come near. Same imagery, different throne, different gospel. And if that is true, then December 25th becomes less like a stolen holiday and more like a battleground, where two religions claim the same symbol, but only one dares to say the symbol is not God. Now, to make this more than theory, consider a real-life analogy. Imagine a city where a massive billboard dominates the skyline, advertising an ideology everyone has grown up with.
a new movement arrives and does not tear the billboard down, it replaces the message on it. The structure stays. The meaning flips. People cannot ignore it because it's in the same place they've always looked. That is what symbolic confrontation looks like. And once you see it that way, the next question changes. It becomes sharper and more mature. Even if the church recentered a symbol, was that a compromise? Or was it a spiritual strategy?
At this point, we must be honest. History does not hand us one clean answer wrapped in certainty. What it hands us is a crossroads, a choice between two interpretations that both have weight. One interpretation says the church strategically aligned its celebration with a culturally meaningful season to make conversion easier and to supplant existing pagan festivals. In this view, the church acts like a missionary in a foreign land. It doesn't ignore the local language. It speaks it. It takes what people already recognize and redirects it toward Christ. There is a certain realism in this. Religions do not grow in laboratories. They grow in cities, in marketplaces, in the friction of daily life. The church did not expand in a vacuum. It expanded in the heart of the Roman world, where symbols were political and politics were spiritual. But there is another interpretation, quieter and more theological. It suggests that the date took shape not primarily from pagan pressure, but from Christian symbolic thinking, linking the incarnation to a wider tapestry of meaning. The logic is not, let's copy their day. The logic is, let's mark the mystery of God entering time in a way that makes theological sense. In this view, any overlap with pagan observances is not proof of imitation. It's proof that public time is contested. The date becomes a collision, not a compromise. So, which is it? Here is the uncomfortable answer. It may be partly both. History often works like this. A community chooses a practice for internal reasons. Then that practice gains external strategic significance in the surrounding culture. A decision made for theology can become a decision that reshapes politics. A tradition formed in worship can become a declaration heard in the streets. And that brings us to the most practical lesson for a modern audience, because this isn't only about ancient calendars. We still live in a world where symbols fight. Every culture assigns meaning to light, to darkness, to renewal, to hope, to identity. Every culture has sacred seasons, even when it calls them secular. Advertisers, ideologies, and movements all compete to define what a season means, because whoever controls meaning controls imagination. So the real question is not merely, where did the date come from? The real question is, what does the date mean now, and who gets to define it? For a Christian, the claim of Christmas is not that the sun has returned. It is that God has come near. That is not a small claim. It is not a sentimental claim. It is a political claim in the deepest sense, because it declares that no empire, no cosmic force, no created light holds ultimate authority. The message is not, celebrate winter. The message is, darkness is not ultimate. And here is the final twist, one that turns the entire controversy into a mirror. When people say Christmas is pagan, they usually mean one thing. Its history is contaminated. But history is always tangled. Every culture is tangled. Every symbol has been used, abused, and reinterpreted. The question is not whether symbols have pasts. They all do. The question is what story you are telling with them. If you tell the story that the sun is God, you will worship what you can see. If you tell the story that God made the sun, you will worship the one you cannot control. And that is why the debate over December 25th endures. Because it is not really a debate about a date. It is a debate about the throne. Which light rules your imagination? The light that rises and sets, or the light that, once it enters, darkness cannot overcome? That is the real conflict beneath the calendar. And perhaps that is why, even after centuries, the question still burns. Was Christmas borrowed, or was it a declaration of war, not against culture, but against the darkness culture often calls divine? So what do we do with all of this? Yes, there are pagan elements in history. Yes, there are solar symbols, ancient calendars, and cultural overlaps. That part is real. But history is not just about origins. History is about meaning. Symbols do not stay frozen in time. They are claimed, challenged, redefined. And whoever controls their meaning shapes the story a civilization tells about itself. When the ancient world worshipped the sun, the church did not bow to it. It pointed beyond it. Not to created light, but to the light that created the sun itself. And maybe that is the part of the story that unsettles us most. Because if Christmas was never about borrowing pagan light, then it may have been something far more radical, a declaration that the true light had entered history and that darkness, no matter how ancient or powerful, was no longer ultimate. That is the history. But now, the more important question belongs to you. What do you think? Was this compromise or confrontation? Was it cultural adaptation or spiritual challenge? Share your perspective in the comments below. We read them, we learn from them, and your insight may shape future conversations on this channel. And if this video pushed you to think deeper, if it challenged what you thought you already knew, consider subscribing. Not because we claim to have all the answers, but because history is always deeper than we're told. And some questions are worth sitting with long after the screen goes dark.